If you would. Excellent. So I'm going to call to order the Information Needs and Data Exchange, the Index Committee, which is, of course, a subcommittee of the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force. My name is Caleb Erickson, and on our agenda today, we are going to be hearing from Jeremy Morton, who is going to give us a bit of an overview of the Gelada case management system, which I understand is what our emergency medical services throughout the county are using. And Jeremy, if you could give us, well, first correct me if I'm wrong, and then help us to understand some of those connections that might exist, and then we can go from there. Jeremy, if you're saying something, you're on mute. I can't hear you. There you go.
Hey, Caleb. So yeah, I can definitely. Would you like me to launch into the whole thing, or did you have other business before this section?
No, you are actually the first thing on the agenda.
Oh, very good.
After calling to order. What I was wondering is, do you have something that you would like to show on your screen? We can make you a presenter.
Yes, please. Note that I have two windows that I'm logged in as, one that has video and one that does not. The window that does not have video is the one I need to be able to share on.
Okay. Joe, can we make that happen?
Okay, I'm going to share that one. Hello, my name is Jeremy Morton. I work for Whatcom County EMS. I'm the lead analyst for the EMS system, for the GRACE program, and then the LEAD program. GRACE being a primarily medical diversion with some law enforcement diversion programs, and LEAD being a much more in-depth program in terms of legal diversion. We're in the process of implementing a system called Gelada, which will allow for a lot of cross-connectivity between agencies to do so securely and report regularly on that information. This is all very much part of the genesis from the GRACE program and project that was initiated several years ago. And it is in keeping with the hub and spoke model, is that there is a central organization that all the other organizations are able to connect to. The elevator speech is that over the course of years, everyone is aware that we have individuals that move between different parts of emergency systems, whether it be the emergency room, law enforcement, jail, EMS. What we did not have is an ability to quantify and track the impact those individuals had on the system or in any particular agency. And so this is just a very general map of all the agencies that GRACE interacts with. And our goal is to then bring that information into a secure and shareable kind of format. And the vendor to do that was chosen was Gelada. And I apologize, I'm an information worker by instinct, so I talk quickly, and there's a lot of data, and so I'm trying to keep it service level, but if I get too far in the weeds, just send up a flare there.
Don't worry, we'll tackle you.
Perfect. So from a system implementation standpoint, I believe in an iterative model, at least part of my training, frankly. It's not really a matter of belief. What we do is that we go through and we map what it is we want the program to do, and we go through and we align terminology and other things, so that when we're interacting with other agencies and as we're building our systems, there's a very test, try, and then redress as we kind of go through our system. So if something doesn't work, we fix it, we go back and we do it again. That documentation process gives us a longitudinal view of the program and what it was designed to do. In this case, in the center, you will see GRACE, and you'll see this pattern repeated over and over. We have community here on the left-hand side. We have our individuals that interact with our various emergency agencies. And then there's a flow chart that discusses how GRACE manages these patients and making sure that nobody's turned away from services, but also making sure that if GRACE is the best fit solution, they're enrolled, and if they're not, they're directed to where they can get services. The goal, I think, of both GRACE and LEAD is to try and break the cycle of crisis. So when people are hitting the system over and over again, from the law enforcement side, I think the best example is somebody has an adverse event, they're taken to the ED can't hold them, they're released, officers bump into them again, sometimes the same day, sometimes within an hour or so, and the cycle begins anew. Our goal is to break that cycle and engage people in services. Speaking to that iterative process, there is the project mapping, and we're also in the process of doing this all for LEAD as well. Once we have our process mapped, we then pull in technology and try to see what technology will be the best fit in order to address the need. And that ultimately migrates to the current layout of GRACE and LEAD. So that folks know they do share staff, but they are distinctly different programs in many regards. And so this is a bit of a system map. So I don't have a more simplified one. The short version here is that, again, we have our community here on the left. We have our referring organizations, or when individuals are interacting with emergency services, they're able to send that information electronically to GRACE securely and regularly. And the Gelada platform allows us to have a master patient index. That's a nice way of saying a list where we've identified certain individuals, and we're able to attach medical information or law enforcement information and have that information be securely accessed. We have the ability to report from Gelada, which allows us to, especially for LEAD and whatnot, in order to secure funding and show the efficacy of our programs. And then going into Q2 this year, our next phase after we point information systems to Gelada, which is acting as our community health exchange, basically. The community information exchange is what we're calling it, I think. Being able to share out that information in public-facing and partner-facing dashboards so that people have an idea of what is and is not going on inside of the community. Before I jump to the platform itself, does anyone have any questions?
I'm not hearing any. I think you can continue.
So when we look at the platform itself, it is just like any kind of other medical record system. You have the ability to have, people's names and their birth dates. You'll notice this person's 100 years old, because test data, when people are 120 years old, that kind of flags that this is not a real person. But we have medical history, medications, labs, vitals, weights. One of the big pushes we're working on right now is connecting our various emergency systems under one umbrella. And so I've been working and having a bunch of great work with the folks that run the jail registry. This be Mr. Erickson's team, and working on a web service that will port over the jail registry so that we can reconcile the enrollments and programs versus someone's jail days and begin pulling metrics. The goals of creating an intercommunication between agencies, we would like to implement discharge planning, it's on the hospital side, when someone's going to be released, to be able to coordinate with the caseworkers at the jail as well as the caseworkers in the field, so that if there's going to be a gap in care or coverage, be able to help fill that gap, to be able to help people get connected back with their Medicare, Medicaid services like that. And so all that information can be entered by our caseworkers here at the Gelada platform. In the background, we actually have a tremendous amount of flexibility in integrating information from CAD, the jail, Bellingham Police Department, Sheriff's Office. We can then have that information under one umbrella and then begin genuinely tracking the impact a single individual may have on individual systems. So if someone has been seen by the emergency room multiple times or been seen by EMS multiple times, but they're currently enrolled in GRACE or LEAD, suddenly those caseworkers can be alerted automatically to engage that person and figure out why it is they might be ramping up, and engage them before we get to the point of crisis, before they need to be arrested, before they need to be admitted to the ED. That's kind of where we're going with all of that. The reason why we're heading toward a community information exchange kind of methodology is that a lot of the reports that we're currently doing are done manually, which, it's not that it can't be done, but it's not the most efficient way to do it. And as our data sets increase, it becomes very difficult to manage. This is an example of 2020 and the enrollment status just for a GRACE program. At a glance, we have, how many enrollments were opened, how many were closed, where the enrollments are coming from. We have similar breakdowns by age, race, demographic, services offered. All of that now is at a touch of a button, whereas before it would take most of an afternoon or two to get these metrics together. It's very important for a lot of it's funding, honestly. A lot of it is going through and showing to various political bodies that these programs work. the information that we have available to us, we've seen utilization or inappropriate utilization drop 80 to 90% for individuals, and for a population anywhere from 70 to 85%. When people are engaged in services, I can say confidently, they are no longer inappropriately utilizing emergency services, which is a savings to everybody, and it frees up our providers and our law enforcement officers to focus on different work. So that is the dimensions of the general plan and kind of where we're going with all of that. This is also slightly related to the work that is going on determining if there needs to be alternative dispatch or any other kind of programs implemented. Know that we're in the process right now of looking at law enforcement data and quantifying it in terms of how much work is happening in terms of calls, the kinds of offenses that we're seeing, classifying those offenses. So here's a breakdown of things that are, felonies, infractions, misdemeanors, other work, calls that are flagged to behavioral health. This is Bellingham police data. And so it is really rather interesting, because coming from hospital EMS land, we're very accustomed to going through and reviewing all of the aggregate information involved with our calls. And we use that to make evidence-based and very systematic decisions. And so, for example, sometimes people will say something along the lines of Bellingham Police Department for behavioral health calls oftentimes use force. And then at the analyst side of the things, we actually have no real strong opinion. Ours is to quantify any and all claims that are made. Going through the information from 2020 from the Bellingham Police Department, they actually go through and they track their outcomes in terms of reports, or if some things were reported, they weren't reported, if it ended in citation, if a call was canceled. For their body of work, they also map if force was used. And so according to the records of the 1,300, 1,600 calls in 2020, I can say that according to the records, 1,300 of which, or 1,100 of which, did not end in any kind of use of force. Only 30 actually did. And that is really the bread and butter of what the analyst team at EMS and Grayson Leader in the process of doing, is transitioning from kind of firsthand knowledge to kind of organizational knowledge of what is and is not happening at any given time.
Jeremy, can I interrupt with a question real quick?
Most certainly.
So the graphs that we saw before, those were inside of Gelada, but these are Tableau data.
Yes, sir.
The Tableau data that you're saying, showing the categories on the right there, is that all Bellingham police records, or is that an aggregate of sheriff's office records, jail, as you mentioned, and those other categories that you mentioned before?
At the moment, these are specifically just each and every agency. What I'm actually in the process of doing right now, which just looks like total madness, is normalizing information and linking it together so that I can actually aggregate all of that data together. So this is, for example, is everything out of the CAD. All of these, especially law enforcement, all touch the CAD system and all share these case numbers. My goal is to look at the specific jurisdictions and then look at the times, and then start looking at the types of calls that are happening and quantifying how long calls take, what calls take longer, what calls take shorter. All of this is to kind of get arms around what is and is not happening inside of our community.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure I understood what we were looking at.
No, it's all good. It's like having a jet engine apart on the kitchen table. It's all fitting together quite nicely, but there's a lot of moving parts to it. And one of the questions I oftentimes am asked in terms of what it costs to the system in terms of infrastructure and whatnot. Image Trend is its own separate animal. I think the law contract is in the $27,000-$37,000 range. And then especially as we migrate and include more partners, we just have more infrastructure costs for supporting reporting and other kinds of access. So for example, to have a Tableau analytics services attached, we probably have another budget increase of around $12,000 annually, but that would allow us to suddenly not only have all this information under this umbrella, our community data from EMS and fire, from the local police departments, and from the jail registry, and be able to have that all reportable and diceable so that we can work more closely with our various community partners.
So if I understand your graphic here, all of the information is categorized and sort of created an aggregate in Gelada, and then that aggregate is sent to Tableau Analytics, or is it aggregated in Tableau? I just want to make sure I understand where the resting place is for the data.
The resting place is in Gelada, and that's in a secure cloud and meets and exceeds all medical data HL7 security standards. And it's one of the advantages of the platform because it was designed implicitly to share information. So we can point servers at it, we can upload documents manually, we can punch them in by hand. It allows us to meet organizations where they're at technologically and still bring that information under one umbrella, normalize it, and then report out on it. You know, if we got really ambitious, we could work out all kinds of interesting solutions. We're pointing different things at Tableau, but for the time being, this is in general terms where we're heading.
Yeah, I'm just curious if, you know, because the job of the index committee as a whole is to, you know, gather criminal justice information and, you know, try and find a way to make it available in more meaningful ways so that we can give the stakeholders and the community members as much information as possible to make informed decisions moving forward with what you know. Now you know more about the criminal justice system, and then what do we do about it? So that's, I was just, you know, kind of going over in my head what your imaging is saying, and so, you know, is something like this available for, you know, the greater criminal justice system, and that's what I was asking specifically, because I've seen Tableau used in different ways, and I wasn't sure if that was the resting place for the data.
No, Gelada is the resting place for that data. Tableau is simply a way to access it and be able to slice it securely. Being able to have it hosted through Gelada, it takes a lot of infrastructure and costs away from the county, frankly. And it gives us a lot more agility to use our information sharing agreements, our data sharing agreements, making sure everything is signed off and approved, which is a huge, huge part of this process. There's a huge technical side, which is my emphasis just because of my training. There is so much work that goes into the front end to making sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of information sharing. But you bring up an excellent point in that the more I get into the law enforcement information, the more I really begin to appreciate the workflow of the 911 system, and how this is a simplified graphic of how a 911 dispatch kind of looks inside of the community, and how a 911 call develops and is monitored on the law enforcement side of things. And what's been interesting is that you become acutely aware of the sheer scope of law enforcement work, and then coming from the background in medical information, that the systems designed to record that information are not keyed to share and aggregate and kind of and suss all that data, because it just wasn't important. It wasn't part of the workflow. And so as we progress, the more we learn about the systems, all of these systems bump into each other. Law enforcement, EMS, fire work together constantly, just part of the work. And as we begin looking at ways to improve our emergency response for behavioral health or alternative dispatch or whatever it may be, the best tool I've seen thus far is Gelada, because it gives us so much flexibility to pull this information in, hold it securely, and report on it as we see fit. What we're doing, especially in the North Sound, Washington State, I think in the country, is pretty leading edge. This is not common work yet. And so this has been the best opportunity from our perspective, from the Grace and Lead side of things, to have this all under one umbrella. And especially as it's interesting, you start any kind of public diversion program, and the first thing everybody wants is all the information. Like, well, actually, there's a lot of work that goes into the background of that. We have to get all these agreements, we have to get the workflow going, we have to kind of automate it as much as humanly possible, because as our data set grows, For case in point, the CAD information from the past 2 years, it would 2019 and 20 as 330,000 some odd rows just out of the gate. Then reconciling that against the 70 some thousand rows we have out of the EMS system, and just it's kind of this exponential kind of growth factor, which is exciting, but it makes this infrastructure work so important.
Yeah, and then data validation comes into it when you, especially when you're trying to tie data points together that don't necessarily have the same sort of reference from one to another. So.
Yeah, it's something that when working with the jail registry team is definitely a concern and a technical challenge to make sure that as we start building our master patient index, how are we weighting records, making sure we're attaching the right records to the right people? If someone isn't completely identified, how are we managing those errors? What are the rate of those errors? So on and so forth. It's something that medical record systems have dealt with in Ignasium over the past 20 years. But as we march into diversion and law enforcement, just hasn't been as important.
Excellent. Again, sorry for derailing. I just want to make sure.
No, you're 100%. And that's about the extent of it. I can get anyone's eyes to glaze over if I'm really focused. So I try to keep things short and to the point. But yeah, if you guys have any other questions or anything like that, I'm right here.
I think this is a great overview. There's a lot to process. Anybody else have anything on the panel that I'm not seeing everybody, so. I'm not seeing anybody who is looking to jump in at this point. So maybe Jeremy, if you could stick around just for a couple minutes to see if somebody has a question that they wanted to ask but didn't get in here before we get too far afield.
Well, certainly, no problem.
Excellent. And I do appreciate very much your time. It is certainly helpful for us to see this, especially with the graphics. So I appreciate that. A lot of work is clearly being done in this sector, but oftentimes we don't know how much work is being done until we kind of put it on a page like this. So I appreciate your efforts very much. It is exciting to see. I think this is exactly where we need to be going as a community, and it is it's really good to see that effort is being made, and I appreciate all your efforts to that end. So thank you. And thank you for being here to present.
And I echo everything Caleb just said, Jeremy. This is really, really a wonderful presentation today, and your explanations were great.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. All right. The next item on our agenda comes from the task force meeting, which was just a couple of days ago. The request came up from the task force that as information comes up, or rather request for information comes up, that we have a specific point where, if somebody has a question that's burning a hole in their pocket, who do I ask? And I will open that up to the discussion for the group. I have my own opinions about that, but I want to see what everybody else has to say about that. And if you need more clarity, because sometimes they don't make that much sense, let me know.
So Caleb, let me start it off. Maybe we have a process that we use for requesting funds. From the various subcommittees that go back into the larger group, the task force itself. Maybe something along that line of just a request form, and identify the fields as far as what's meaningful and how they might be able to request data. I mean, that comes to mind to me as kind of a first step.
All right, Chief.
I see one concern with that is that sometimes what people specify as what they ask for is not actually what it is that they want. And part of that is because we will use different terminology sometimes, or a particular word will mean something different in the jail than it does for law enforcement, than it does for Brenda out of the public defender's office. So one of the things that oftentimes has to happen is that you spend a little bit of time talking to someone to parse out what it is that they're really looking for, because otherwise you give them numbers and they're going, this is meaningless, I have no idea what this means. And so that could be, and sometimes it takes a while to figure out exactly what we're looking for. That would be my biggest concern, is that we spend a lot of time.
I agree with you, Wendy. It needs to be an iterative process so it can be well defined what the request is. I agree.
Yeah, and that both of those are good points. I think that the key that I would like to take away, if you were to have an action item here, is that we know going away from this meeting, we have at least a starting point in terms of who to point an email, say, or where do I have a question that I want to know about the data that's going on and the work that they're doing in the index committee. Where does that data go? And that's the hope as a product where we can say, all right, well, you fill out this form, you send an email to this address, and then at that point, Chief, then we pick it up and say, we go, okay, you're asking me this question, but I don't understand. Can you help me to understand what you're looking for? And we get more into the specifics of what the ask is. But if we were to have an action item, it needs to be, you need to talk to this person or send an email or fill out a form, and then that form goes to in order, because what the danger is, I think, is going forward is we'll end up with a lot of requests for information that don't necessarily get to the right place, and then we don't end up dealing with them here, or we get a whole bunch of information requests, but then we can't sort through them all because they're coming through different channels. So that was the request from the task force itself, that we figure that out. And again, I have my own opinion about how it should work, but Councilmember Buchanan came up with a form. Does anybody have anything else?
I'd love to hear what you have in mind, Caleb.
The one concern, and then I'll hush up, the one other concern I have is that, as Jeremy pointed out, pulling that data and information together is time intensive. And I know of none of the bureaus and agencies that we work with that has anybody who does that full time, except for potentially Jeremy. And so it becomes a time management issue for staff. I mean, poor Caleb's wound up on 2 committees now related to the task force, which is great, except that there are other things he's also trying to do within the jail. So that it's balancing that. I guess I would ask for that there may need to be some parameters on the amount of time that we can dedicate staff to that.
Okay, appreciate that caution, Chief. And again, I don't think that this is an intention to try and commit the index committee to any amount of time or any particular efforts, but so just an effort to funnel or direct questions if people have them, especially, even members of the greater task force. They want to know an answer to a question. How do I get that question properly sent to the index committee for management? For me, the answer is that we have an email address that is created for the index committee for those type of requests. I don't believe it would be terribly complicated to have something like that created, either a distribution list or a mailbox that can be sent to. And I don't mind if there's a form associated with that, but then people can say, all right, I'm going to send emails about the sort of questions that I have to this email address, and then, we can manage it from that standpoint. Harry?
We can certainly set up a distribution list, but we'd need to identify who it goes to.
Okay. So does any
work offline on that with you, Caleb, if you'd like?
Okay. Does anybody have any issues if we explore that direction of travel? All right, I would entertain a motion in that regard.
So moved.
Do we have a second? Chief seconds. All right. Any discussion about that? Okay. if you are in favor of creating an email address in terms of a distribution list for the index committee, please signify by saying aye.
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 All right. Anybody want to say no? And anybody want to abstain? Hearing none, that motion will pass, and I will discuss with Perry offline about the particulars and who that should go to. Next on our list is on the agenda is discussion of possibly hiring Dr. James Austin with the JFA Institute to consult on next steps for the index committee. This is something that I don't remember the framework for this particular agenda item, and I believe Mr. Schroeder might have some input on that.
Yeah, hey group, Tyler Schroeder, Deputy Executive, Whatcom County. Good to see everybody. Just so Caleb understands, Christmas was last month, not this month. So I think the Christmas tree might need to go back into the.
This is a corrections deputy memorial Christmas tree. So.
Excuse me. Now, over the years, there's been a lot of conversation about next steps with the index committee, and Councilmember Buchanan and I, probably actually 2 years ago now, since we lost 2020, we had lots of conversations about bringing in an expert to kind of understand where our data is and see what the next steps were. So a lot of that, remember, was we were talking through that, and that's what led to the data matrix, so that we had a reference so that we could make sure we could point any individual or expert that came in to say where the data was and what data we're collecting and what the data is being used for. I caught just the glimpse in the last end of Jeremy's presentation. So, you know, I think with that information, there's also a lot more data collection and usability of some of that information that would be super helpful for anybody to come in. And I think actually, without kind of knowing it, there has been groups in the community through Jeremy's work and other work that are kind of starting to do some of that data collection and also some of that data analysis, but to take the next step. So James Austin was an expert in the nation that has a good information of criminal justice data and a good knowledge set of trying to figure out how the communities could use it. I would also, I think we're fairly familiar with Vera Institute. That's a similar operation as well, or you know, entity that would maybe do some of this work. And you know, I would say, from my background from the index committee, we're all very good at showing information and directing where that could be. But I think the next step, and Councilmember Buchanan, please help here, would kind of be how do we then use it from a policy standpoint, and what policy questions is the larger task force really looking forward into. So it could be a recommendation from the index committee to the larger task force that we kind of recommend the larger task force to consider bringing an expert in to look at our data and to help the larger task force define the next policy questions. And what we would do there is put a quick RFQ or RFP together, request for proposals or qualification surrounding that. We already kind of have a framework of that. Run that out, contact some of those experts and see what we get. I think there would be some budgeting that would need to happen through the county, but I think Councilmember Buchanan and the executive's office could take care of that if that's something the task force is interested in doing. So Barry, did I miss anything, or were you looking for more?
Look, just add one thing. Kind of the reason that James Austin's name kind of floated up to this agenda item is that James he's not just a number cruncher. He's really good at understanding why the data is important. He's good at understanding both from nuts and bolts to kind of the 30,000 foot level. So he's a very experienced criminal justice reform type person that really uses data and really has a plain spoken way to to convey that to his audience. We saw him in San Francisco when we were down there for a conference, and he did just a wonderful presentation on criminal justice data. And I think someone like him would be really valuable for the task force to be able to break it down into that plain spoken terminologies that the way he works. He's really, really good at it. So that was kind of why his name came up.
Excellent. I appreciate that, Mr. Schroeder, Councilmember Buchanan. I forgive myself. It's been a long time since we discussed this. So if I've forgotten, it's because it was a long time ago. It wasn't just because I forgot. So simply forgot. Okay. So from what I'm hearing, it sounds like that would be sort of we've got this data. What do we do about it? Kind of a discussion point with him. And that sounds like definitely something that we should do. I would entertain a motion then, hearing those last 2 points, that we consider getting feedback back to the main task force for such an RFP. Does that sound fair?
I'll go ahead and move that we approach the task force on that.
Okay. Second by the chief. Good. Everybody in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Anybody opposed? And anybody want to abstain? Okay. That motion will pass. The next thing, kind of part of that is not listed as a discussion
Tyler?
point.
Caleb, Tyler has a question.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Caleb, and then I'll ask if you're not going to cover it here.
Okay, well, one of the things that I wanted to bring up as part of this discussion point is, you know, we've got this data, and what are we going to do about it is a great direction of travel, I think, in terms of like where we're going to go with this information. But we talked at the task force meeting a couple of days ago. We don't have a very good repository for instance, all, you know, sort of the publicly available data. And I think that we need to at least have a discussion about what information that we truly have available, how we make it available to, you know, even an analytics system for more development and refinement. And so I don't know what that looks like. I'm speaking from a position of desire, but I don't actually know, you know, the shape of this. I think we talked early on in the index committee days about, you know, if we had an off-the-shelf software that would sort of gather all of the information from our various stakeholders and community groups, but I don't think that it exists. And if it does, I'm not aware of it, but it would be very important, at least in my view, to actually gather the data into a place that can be further analyzed. And so I think that has to be mentioned at this stage before, and not just before, but as we're talking about, you know, sort of we've got this information, what we do about it, we have to recognize that we don't really have a repository. Go ahead, Perry.
Is that something that James Austin could help us with?
I'm seeing heads. So Tyler, is that the case?
Yeah, it was somewhere where I was going. And, you know, I think you could kind of have that national information come in and say, okay, what do other communities use as a public platform, and what public data is available, and how is that accomplished? And that could be a portion of the RFP, RFQ, so that when that expertise comes in, it's not just a policy information, but it's also kind of from a social, what kind of data should be out there in the public to be available. And, you know, there are a couple of new record management systems that are through the criminal justice system that the county will be moving forward with, and that information will be helpful for the public defender's project and for the prosecuting attorney's office project, tying in the EMS data that Jeremy just talked about, looking at the jail data and everything else. So I think that could be in the RFQ and RFP.
Oh, good. I mean, we talked about it again at the task force meeting a couple of days ago. There has been a lot of emphasis on the information available in Spillman, which is great. And I think that is important to recognize that as a relatively new records management system, Spillman has a lot of data that otherwise wouldn't be available. But it is not in absolutely any way a representative of the entire picture of what's going on in our criminal justice system and our community. There are many other data points that could be collected and maybe aren't even really available at this point, again, because they're hand tabulated or they're kept in paper files. And that information, I think, is extremely valuable in terms of how the whole machine and the health of our entire criminal justice system can be viewed. So I don't want to lose track of that insight, and all this discussion is that, again, we've talked about Spillman, but it isn't the only place that this information can be gathered. See, Chief?
I think that one of the things specifically Tyler and Barry that the council and the exec's office can do is start greasing the skids a little bit with the municipalities and the tribes. Because one of the things we tend to get focused on a lot of the Superior Court, Whatcom County criminal justice system, because that's oftentimes where the biggest impacts are. It takes longer to get people through the system, etc. But the reality is data that Darlene has and that Bellingham PD has and that the Lummi Nation has all affect the jail, because we can get this crime or this case resolved, but there are 12, 13, 14 other charges that this offender's in. And getting people to understand the complexity is very important. Now, I'm not living in a world where I think everybody's going to open their databases and let us see what they've got, but at least starting that conversation so that if there's a point where we pick, maybe the top 15 users of the criminal justice system as a whole, and then we request information from some of the other agencies that we deal with to grease the skids to get that, because it definitely impacts the entire system. We can get somebody have a homicide charge get resolved, but they're having to stay here because Ferndale's decided that they don't want to release him on a 363-day sentence. And that kind of information is stuff the public generally doesn't get and the task force doesn't get. So that's that interagency collaboration, which sometimes works really well and sometimes not so much. So just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and Tyler, again, we can take that on. I can take that on a little bit when we get a little closer. Is there a small cities representative on the index these days?
I'm sorry, Tyler, I missed the last part of that.
Is there a small cities representative on the index committee? There was, but I don't know if there is.
We had Rayan from Blaine.
Yeah. So, but when we get closer, I do know that we have a very useful, productive meeting with the mayors. And so once we start to define it a little bit more before it's fully defined, I'd be happy to kind of carry that conversation.
That would be great.
Into that framework to get to the rest.
I think it's going to really help giving us a true picture of what's going on. I mean, that was one of the problems we ran into with Vera, is that they were making some assumptions based on data coming out of the jail without taking into consideration the impact of the elimination and the long sentences that they would have some of their offenders serving here. So it skewed the population data.
Yep. And some of that was where we went to the matrix, right? Because the matrix was trying to recognize all jurisdictions and all criminal justice entities to where the data is collected.
Thank you.
Darlene?
One thing that I'm concerned about is that we don't have a representative from the Bellingham Police Department, because I think they could have a large voice if, in, the different crimes and figures and statistics that they may gather. And so I think that might be something to look at as well.
Okay, excellent. All right, any other discussion about this? Okay, next agenda item is other business. Does anybody have any other business that needs to be brought up? I'm not seeing any of that. Oh, Darlene, I'm sorry.
Sorry, me again. I just was going to let you know that the municipal and district courts of the state are supposed to be getting a new computer system similar to what superior courts in the state have gotten. They have decided to go with Odyssey with Tyler Industries, which is exciting, so that we'll all have the same database. It'll be a little bit different, but at least it's the same company. We've been advised that for the courts up north here, we're probably looking at the end of this year or maybe the spring of next year. So just something to keep in mind, that once we get that new database, that could change things a little bit.
Excellent, Darlene. Yeah. Last meeting, which unfortunately didn't sound like you were able to attend, we had a presentation from the AOC on their decision to go with Tyler and what stages they were at. It was very, very good to hear. Again, having the information from the courts that is varied and often complex, all coming together under one records management system is really, really fantastic. And it's honestly mind-boggling at the same time, because it's very complicated data. So, but good stuff.
I think, Caleb, one thing to keep in mind with that and Odyssey, since we've been on it for a while with Tyler, is most of our demographic information is pulled from the Department of Licensing. So we don't keep necessarily any of that stuff. I think the courts of lower jurisdiction are going to have the same issue with their information being demographic stuff coming from there as well. And, again, a lot of that's self-reported. So I think there's going to be a lot of benefits from that, but I think we're still going to have some of those obstacles on, gathering race and ethnicity and those sorts of things over a period of time.
Yeah. Okay. Good point, Dave. Thank you. Any other business? Did I see one? I'm sorry, Perry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, we have a lot of technology projects lined up for this year. Tyler mentioned new public defender case management system. He mentioned new prosecutor case management system. We also are working with Dave Reynolds, and there's a Tyler Odyssey upgrade in 2 weeks. And then after that upgrade, we're looking at using the Tyler supervision module to meet his juvenile case management needs. And then we'll be working with Chief Jones and Caleb and a new electronic medical records system. And I will have the okay to you shortly, Caleb and Wendy, on that contract. And we're also about to kick off the body cams in the sheriff's office in 2 weeks. So from an IT perspective, it's a very ambitious year with new case management systems. And as we work with each vendor and each implementation, we'll be thinking about the entirety of the situation for data sharing and integration and things like that.
Excellent, Perry. Thank you. Any other business? Great. Jill, do we have anybody from the public?
We have 2 attendees today. If either of you would like to speak to the committee, please virtually raise your hand right now. No hands are raised at this time.
All right. That is it for us, folks. We can adjourn.
See you, everybody.